compromise deal or none at all? Reports from Israeli media that a compromise had been accepted by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the government's contentious judicial reforms were shot down after a few hours by ministers from the governing coalition and the opposition. However, Israeli President and judicial reform mediator Isaac Herzog did say that he was holding indirect talks to revive the dialogue, which collapsed 2 months ago. Herzog's plans for a compromise include softening the bill abolishing the reasonableness standard, freezing changes to the Judicial Selection Committee for 18 months, and increasing the majority needed for the Selection Committee to approve Supreme Court appointments. The reports say that Benjamin Netanyahu would be interested in the compromise to help lower the tensions that have engulfed his third stint as Prime Minister. But will he bow to pressure from his right-wing government and power through with a judicial overhaul? Or will Netanyahu never say never to a deal? Is a compromise deal better than no deal for the opposition? What will be enough to satisfy the protesters who have entered their 35th week of protesting the reforms? Is Herzog's judicial compromise fair?
All right, gentlemen, you know the rules. You each get 30 seconds to make your initial case, and then we'll pick up into the debate forum from there. The main question at hand is Israeli President Isaac Herzog's judicial compromise fair, the one he presented? Yehudah, we'll start with you.
Shalom, shalom to you, and shalom to all of those who are viewing. I want to say very simple. Unity is a very important Jewish Israeli value, and we have to do everything we can to get there. But when we're talking about compromise, we have to be compromised. Compromise does not mean that one side totally gives in. And unfortunately, the protesters are willing to one thing, and that's the head of Benjamin Netanyahu. I think we have to stand up for a compromise, which includes giving in on both sides.
All right, Gil, your take.
The president's compromise is the only game in town, and there has to be a game in town because the security pressure, the political pressure, the diplomatic pressure from the White House when Netanyahu wants to get invited there and wants to have a Saudi deal move forward, require there to be both extremes being rejected. And the president convincing both the prime minister and the leaders of the opposition to make a deal in time. And there's still plenty of time left. The Knesset doesn't even come back for more than a month.
David, your thoughts there?
Thanks. I think there are two important questions here. One is about the soundness of the details of the suggested compromise, and the other is about trust. When it comes to the details, the first thing to say is that we don't yet have a full picture of those details. We don't have all of the information, but also that some of the details that have emerged already mark a very nice achievement for the protests, and that others are deeply troubling. Now, perhaps that could have been dealt with by future negotiations, but future negotiations, in order to successfully deal with these kinds of issues, must be based on trust, and now nobody trusts Netanyahu at all.
All right, let's get the debate going. The Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, reporting that the compromise agreement, that he's rejected it, and that actually the Prime Minister is on his side. So where should both the coalition and the opposition begin when it comes to trying to form any sort of compromise? Yehudah, we'll start with you.
As I said before, compromise has to be taking into consideration two things. There were Israeli elections, and one side won the elections, and they have all the rights to lead the government and its policy. So that's what a compromise is all about. A compromise also has to take into consideration the fact that the next elections in Israel will happen in a few years, and therefore this government has to reach an achievement. If we take into consideration both those issues, and at the same time, the goodwill of Netanyahu and Yariv Levin to sit down and compromise, we have one side that's interested in compromise and another side that unfortunately has turned down every single option of compromise.
Well, David, how do you respond to them? Because the Justice Minister actually rejected the reported compromise. And how can the opposition come to the table when the Justice Minister is saying one thing and the Prime Minister is saying another?
That is, of course, one important problem here. You rightly emphasize it. But I think the issue runs deeper than that. To present things as if the coalition is for compromise, that the protest or the opposition has been rejecting, is just totally to ignore the facts. There has been here a huge assault on basic democratic values. And under the threat of this assault, now people on the left or on the opposition or people who take part in the protest are sort of being encouraged to compromise and sort of go for like a half-baked semi-democracy or dictatorship rather than a full one. That's not a compromise. Talk of compromise is, of course, sometimes relevant and important, but it's especially important when we are, dividing a good between us or something like this. This is not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here are the democratic, constitutional, liberal essentials, and about those, a compromise is not the aim. At most, it will be something we'll have to settle with. The aim is to secure the democratic nature of the State of Israel.
All right, Gil, I want to move to Benjamin Netanyahu speaking, trying to appeal to Benny Gantz for their teams to meet to talk about this type of compromise. But Benny Gantz seeming a little bit reluctant to accept that invitation, speaking tonight, using some strong words against the prime minister. Let's take a listen and then we'll discuss from there.
I want to appeal to Benny Gantz. We have many differences, but we also have a lot in common. Both of our names are Benjamin. We both fought on the battlefield against a common enemy. And today, the majority of people expect us to do something for a common goal. They want us to come to an agreement. But in order to reach agreements, you have to do one simple thing. Put aside all the preconditions, all the obstacles, enter the room and talk.
My friends, it would not be a surprise to you or to anyone else. I do not trust Netanyahu, who does what's good for Netanyahu and only then what's right for the people.
All right, Gil, we'll start with you. And gentlemen, remember, feel free to jump in if you agree, disagree, want to comment on something. But Gil, why should Benny Gantz trust Benjamin Netanyahu given their very rocky history?
They're not going to start trusting each other after 5 elections against each other. But the way to build trust is to meet privately and not fight each other on TV. If Netanyahu really cared about reaching out to Gantz, he would have met with him privately. He would have gone back from his trip to Cyprus, gone together with Sarah to Gantz's house straight from the airport and said, okay, I'm serious. I want to reach a deal right now. Nobody's paying any attention right now while the Knesset is on its break. The president gave me this proposal. I gave the president a proposal, and let's handle it quietly without leaking it to the media. And then Gantz would have responded privately to the prime minister. They would be meeting directly, maybe take along their most trusted confidant, Ron Dermer on one side, Billy Tropper on the other side. People are not extremists in any way. People basically get along and agree on key issues. That's the way you get a deal done, and there's still a month to do it. Instead, Netanyahu released this statement appealing to Gantz 15 minutes before the nightly news primetime broadcast because he's talking to the people to get his alibi. And then Gantz spoke at a political rally of his party, a pre-Rosh Hashanah toast that was aired at great length on the nightly news broadcast too. And that's the way you fight. That's not the way that you reach a deal when the people of Israel, if you look at the polls, and I don't think either your representative from the right or the left here was really looking at the polls, the people want a deal to be done.
David, how should trust be fostered between these two? I mean, 5 elections, like Gil mentioned, it's not really being done privately. Does Netanyahu actually want a deal if he's not pursuing these more private type of negotiations?
It's very hard to speculate about what Netanyahu's motivations are. One of the really depressing things is that the kind of conspiracy theories that we would all just dismiss maybe a year or two ago, everything now sounds plausible given what we know about Prime Minister Netanyahu. I also want to say that I don't think it's fair to present the issue as if it's a symmetrical one about the absence of trust between Mr. Gantz and Mr. Netanyahu. The problem is very much one direction. It's directed at Netanyahu, and it's not just about Gantz. No one, as far as I know, in Israeli politics trusts Netanyahu at all. That is a very dangerous situation for a country to be in. The prime minister cannot reach pragmatic compromises with anyone because no one takes their word. I don't know that that can be changed with the current prime minister.
And Yehudah, critics are saying that these reforms, they've been saying this for months, since the beginning of the year, these reforms are going to put a liberal democracy at stake, saying that Israel is bordering a dictatorship. The intentions of the prime minister are not so clear. He's saying one thing, but he wants to mean another. So is the democracy at stake here, like these critics are saying?
I think you just heard from Professor Enoch the attitude of the opposition in this country. They think they have all the truth by them, and the coalition led by Netanyahu is totally the Satan himself, the devil himself. And I think that's the problem. Because when you lose an election, democracy means that one side wins the election. But you heard Professor Enoch said specifically, we don't have any compromise. We want to compromise, but we have all the truth.
That is not what I said.
I mean,
that is not what I said
That's
at
exactly
all.
what you said. It's exactly what you said.
We can run the tape. It's not what I said. What I said was that compromise is not the aim. Compromise may be the right means, but it's not the aim.
But democracy means democracy. Does not mean when a court takes over the country. We're now facing a major issue right now. And next week, there's a risk that the Supreme Court will go out and cancel a basic law, which is actually Israel's constitution. There's a danger that the opposition is leading and encouraging to. And this situation, where total demonization of the prime minister, of the elected government, and they are calling this democracy. That's in Hebrew, that's called one word. It's called chutzpah.
These misleading statements have to be. These misleading statements have to be corrected. First, the basic laws are not Israel's constitution. That is just plainly false. Here's one really important comparison, for instance, compared to the US. All that it takes in order to either put in place or amend a basic law is a simple majority vote in parliament. Compare this to how practically impossible it is to amend the US Constitution. So this is just, what you said there just has absolutely no connection to the truth, just at all. The other thing is that the kind of conception of democracy you're putting forward is if it's all about a majority vote, is not just obviously wrong. Obviously, the majority can make undemocratic decisions. But it's worse than that. Even the Minister of Justice himself has by now admitted that the initial steps, all motivated by precisely this rhetoric, would lead Israel into a dictatorship. This is said on the record. We have the recording. So you are now, instead of getting the discussion forward, you're pushing us back to something that even the Minister of Justice no longer accepts.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to take a quick pause here. We're out for a little bit of a break and then more of our debate right after this. Welcome back to Global Eye. Thanks for staying with us. Our panel still on deck: Yehudah Glick, Gil Hoffman, and Professor David Enoch. So still with our main topic here, the judicial reforms, but switching gears a little bit to security and how the reforms are affecting them. Let's take a listen now to Major Yehudah Glick, an Israeli military advocate.
The Israel Defense Forces' international legitimacy efforts are greatly benefited by the aura, the protection with which the justice system provides it, particularly the Supreme Court's professional and independent international status. Measures that may harm or be perceived as harmful to the independence, professionalism, and effectiveness of the justice system may crack the aura that the judicial system provides to the military and harms the interests of the State of Israel, of the IDF, and its soldiers in the international arena.
Look, thousands of reservists choosing not to serve in protest of the judicial overhaul. Some are even saying that Israel's enemies like Lebanon, Iran, Syria, Palestinian factions perhaps could be planning a larger conflict due to the internal discord within the state. Gil, I'm curious to get your take on how you think the judicial reforms, we'll start 30 seconds first. Is Israel's security being harmed by the judicial reforms, Gil?
Oh, you have the head of Hezbollah saying that he's going to test Israel because of the judicial reforms. You have a war that happened in Gaza, in part because Islamic Jihad thought that they could test Israel over the judicial reforms. Now, that happens separately, Hamza. That's okay. We can handle that in Israel. But what we are definitely much more challenged by is a war on multiple fronts, like what happened 50 years ago. We're going to mark the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. If you have multiple fronts attacking Israel, that is what poses a threat to our future. And it doesn't matter if we're weak. It matters if we're perceived we're weak by our enemies.
Yehudah, same question. Is Israel's biggest security threat actually from within?
I think our big security issue from within is definitely a danger. I think that the demagogic rhetoric that we're hearing from the propaganda led by the demonstrators has led a big divide among or at least the atmosphere in the world, that the big divide here in Israel. And it's allowing our enemies to think that we're weak. The fact that they are encouraging doctors to resign, they're encouraging military people to get to not come anymore. That's a big danger from within.
And David, 30 seconds, your take.
So I'm of course not privy to any military intelligence. I suspect that neither are my interlocutors. But it won't be surprising if a reform that shamelessly attacks, or a coalition in government that shamelessly attack the military elite, indeed any other elite that plays a part in constituting Israel's strength. Of course, such reforms are a huge problem also in security terms. I also want to note that Mr. Glick's gaslighting, accusing the victims of the aggression rather than the aggressor, the one who initiates all of these assaults on democracy, is quite frankly maddening.
That's only after you called me a liar by saying that the authority of the Supreme Court comes from the basic laws in Israel, even though that's the very fact. And the very fact that all the basic laws, that the Supreme Court has been basing everything in terms of freedom of religion and freedom of accessibility and everything else, was based on these laws that were accepted by the same majority that you attacked before. And they
you are once again misstating what I said.
So instead of admitting that the protesters are destroying this country step after step and blaming the government for that and calling that democracy, that has nothing to do with democracy. They're
of course, and also the protesters and the protesters against Orban. The protesters against Orban, I'm sure, are responsible for the problems in Hungary. The protesters against the Polish government, including the judicial overhaul in Poland, are responsible for damages there. This kind of gaslighting doesn't even convince coalition members. It will certainly not fly with our audience.
Don't be a demagogue. You're responsible for what you're doing.
That's a good argument there, right there.
For using violence and blocking roads. You're responsible
using violence. This is one of the most peaceful protests in the history of the world. There has not been a single attack on a police officer. This is ridiculous. You really have to check your facts from time to time. It's one thing. It's one thing to mislead audience member. It's another to do so stupidly. The facts are very clear, and you just ignore them.
Yes. That's verbal violence. And I want to say that very simple. From the very beginning, the coalition has been calling for a compromise. Not only been calling for a compromise.
That is false. That is false. Check the press. Check Minister Levin's press conference in January. No compromise at all. Check Mr. Rothman's way of running the discussions in the committee. Nothing remotely like a compromise. I have no idea where you get your news from, but it's not from a reliable source.
All right, let's have Gil jump in here a minute. Gil, I'm curious to get your take. These protests have been going on for months and months. The Israeli society is quite divided. There has been a police use of force at these demonstrators. We've been covering it here extensively on the ground. Do you think that the division within Israeli society is also part something that could attribute to the weakness of security of the state?
Look, we found that we certainly need a healing right now. And there have been 36 weeks of protests. We have a government that is very divisive. The protesters have tried to make it look like they represent the broad spectrum of the Israeli population, and they are led by the extreme left. And right now, it needs to be the extremists that let the moderates on both sides reach an agreement. Netanyahu needs to be standing up to Yehudah Levin, to Simcha Rothman, to Smotrich and Ben Gvir, of course, And Benny Gantz needs to be ignoring Yair Lapid and ignoring Bressler and Ehud Barak and the people who organized the protests from the beginning, who we all know already planned protests before Yariv Levin even announced his plan. They've been protesting and planning their strategy since Netanyahu won the election. And so, both sides got their way. One passed one bill, one forced a compromise on another bill. And after they've both won, when the Knesset comes back to session, really the only way to move forward is by reaching compromises that the middle ground can agree to. 80% of Israelis are in favor of some kind of change in the legal system in Israel. And the president has been trying for months to bridge that gap. There's still time. He can do it. But you need to have leadership from both sides on the way. And part of that leadership is rejecting the extremists. If you do that, then we can have better security. We can get an invitation for the prime minister to go to Washington to take steps that will improve our security, lead toward a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia. That's the ultimate consensus.
David, I want to ask you, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who heads the ultra-nationalist Jewish Power Party, said that his 6 members of parliament will actually vote against what he calls a, quote, surrender that comes up to a vote. So how can there be a compromise if he's already saying he won't vote? 30 seconds on the clock.
Probably there cannot be a compromise of this kind. I also want to say that the kind of suggested symmetry that Mr. Hoffman suggested between, say, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich on one side and Yair Lapid, as if that's like the extreme left leader, that already shows what a crazy situation we are in. Lapid is at best center, and this kind of symmetry is, of course, entirely misleading. With people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, there can be no compromise, and the fact that they are still members of the government is just a shame that it's going to be very hard to ignore in the future history of Israel.
All right, Yehudah, we've got about 20 seconds if you'd like to respond.
I want to respond, and we heard very clearly what Professor Enoch said, that anything that the Israeli people voted for is illegitimate. I think that
I said that. Is that what I said?
The way Gil Hoffman put it is it's pretty accurate. We need the moderate people in this country to take over. Unfortunately, the far radical left, from Yair Lapid to Shikma Bressler to Ehud Barak, have taken over the country, and we need to get back to a normal situation where there's democracy in this country and elections mean something.
Hey, I see you liked it. Want more? Just hit the subscribe button right here. Go on. I know you want to.